Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. This is part 5 of the Manson Cults series, and it's going to be a long part, so I am just going to dive right in, which I'm sure is going to make the people who complain about me talking before the video about anything really happy. When we left off in part 5, Tex Watson had just killed Stephen Parent, and he and the girls were approaching the Polanski residence. Inside was Wojtek Frykowski, Abigail Folger, Jay Sebring, and Sharon Tate. Tex told Linda Kasabian to go around the back of the house and see if there was any entry points, any open windows that they could get through. She came back and told Tex that she had found none, which technically wasn't true because the painter had just been in the house that day and he had taken the screens off the nursery windows and left those windows open. So if she had checked at all, she would have seen or found those windows. Did she look at all? If she had looked, if she'd given it any effort, she would have found those open windows. But Tex did find an open window in the entry hall of the house. It was very hot that weekend, as we've already talked about. And a lot of people in the city were keeping their windows open with just the screen so that they could get some airflow into the homes. Tex found the open window and he slid through the screen. Now he told Linda to go back down the driveway so that she could be a lookout. He was concerned that somebody might have heard the gunshots. So she needed to go down there and just keep watch. And if she heard anything, she should shout up to them. It's kind of crazy if you think about it though, because Linda had literally just joined this group a month ago. So maybe Tex figured she hadn't been sufficiently brainwashed to be in the house when what was going to happen started happening. Maybe he thought she would just ruin it or get scared and run away and tell somebody. So he had her be lookout. But he did motion for Pat Krenwinkel and Susan Atkins to follow him inside, which they did. Now, when they got in the house, the first person they noticed was Wojtek Frykowski asleep on the living room couch. Tex whispered to Susan to go and check the rest of the house to see how many other people were in there. So Susan did, and as she walked through the house, she passed the bedroom that Abigail Folger was still awake and reading in. As she passed by the bedroom, Abigail looked up and Susan waved to her, and Abigail waved back. If this seems odd to you that Abigail Folger saw some strange girl in the house and wasn't taken aback or surprised by it, you have to once again remember that this was the 60s and this was Sharon Tate's home and she always had people there. I think it was pretty much a theme of the 60s where you would just have strangers in your house or you would meet somebody that day and invite them over to your home. There wasn't as much of that stranger danger as there is today. Susan Atkins continued down the hallway to the master bedroom. She looked in and she saw Jay Sebring and Sharon Tate sitting on the bed, and they were so deeply engrossed in conversation that they didn't even notice her at all. So she went back down the hallway, and as she passed Abigail's bedroom again, she waved at her again. Now, while she was gone, Wojtek Frykowski had woken up and seen Tex, and in confusion, he had asked Tex, "Who are you?" In response, Tex kicked him in the head and said, "I am the devil, and I'm here to do the devil's business."
I remember when we first went in, one of the people said, "Who are you?" And Tex said, "I'm the devil and I'm here to do the devil's business." And I remember that in my conscience, it's so alive in me, even just recalling it. I remember that I had gone so far and there was no turning back. That even if I had wanted to run, even if I had wanted to leave, I couldn't. It was like I was caught in something that I had no control over. I had absolutely no say-so as to what was happening there. I was just like a tool in the hands of the devil is the only way I can put it.
When Wojtek tried to speak again, Tex told him another word and you're dead. At this time, Pat Krenwinkel realized the knife that she couldn't find before they'd left Spahn Ranch, she might be needing that. So she ran down to Linda at the front of the driveway and asked to borrow hers. When Susan told Tex how many other people were in the house, he told her to go back and get them and bring them all into the living room, which she did. This time, when she went back to the guest bedroom, Susan waved again, but this time she waved a knife in Abigail Folger's face and told her that she would die if she didn't do exactly as she was told. She brought Abigail back to the living room where Pat was waiting with Linda's knife to hold her at knife point, while Susan went back to the master bedroom and collected Jay and Sharon. When she let the two of them into the living room, Sharon panicked a little bit because she saw the rest of the intruders and she kind of realized the gravity of the situation. And she kind of paused. She didn't want to keep walking. And Tex Watson grabbed her roughly and pulled her into the living room. Abigail was still standing terrified at knife point, and Wojtek Frykowski was still on the couch, but he was a little bit out of it from the kick to the head. Tex instructed Susan to tie Wojtek's hands behind his back, which she did, but with a towel, which is strange because they brought rope. The rope they'd brought, which was a white nylon rope, was used to tie Jay Sebring and Sharon Tate. They tied their hands behind their back, and then Tex proceeded to take the rope and tie it around Jay Sebring's neck. He then threw the loose end of the rope over a rafter in the ceiling, took the other end of the rope and tied it around Sharon Tate's neck. At that point, Jay Sebring had had enough, and he said, "Can't you see she's pregnant?" And in response to that, Tex Watson shot him. He fell to the ground, and Sharon began to sob uncontrollably as Tex demanded that they give him all the money they had in the house. Abigail told them that she had some money in her purse, so Susan took her back to her purse where they discovered $70 inside. When they brought that back, Tex was not happy with it. He knew Charlie needed money, and he knew that these people were rich and they had more money, and he demanded that they give him all the money that they had or they were going to die. Sharon tried to plead with him, and she said, "If you give me some time, I can get more money." I don't know if she was honestly going to give him the money or if she was just trying to buy time. But at that point, on the ground, Jay Sebring groaned, and it gave Tex something to take his outrage out on. And he turned on him and began to stab him over and over again. After he was done with Jay Sebring, Tex Watson looked at Abigail and Sharon, who were crying and visibly upset, and said, "You're all going to die here." Wojtek Frykowski on the couch, still a little bit out of it with his hands tied behind his back with a towel, he heard this and he began to freak out and regain a little bit of his consciousness, enough to realize that he needed to get out of there. So he began to struggle against his towel bonds. He got out of them pretty easily, and he lunged at Susan Atkins to try to get the knife away from her. As they were fighting and struggling, Wojtek Frykowski was pulling on Susan's hair because it was long and probably hanging over him, and she was getting very upset. So she called Tex to help her, and Tex told her to just kill the guy. Now, according to Susan Atkins, she had the opportunity where she could have brought the knife down on Wojtek Frykowski's chest, but she just couldn't bring herself to do it. Right? She just couldn't do it.
I remember that Wojtek Frykowski, I believe is his name, I had tied his hands with a towel and then was instructed to kill him. And I raised the knife that I had in my hand, and I couldn't put the knife down. I couldn't bring it down. It was just as though there was a force there that held my wrist, and I couldn't move. And I remember I was screaming for help, and he was screaming for help, and then Tex came and helped me, and I was left to sit and watch Sharon Tate.
For the record, I don't believe a word that woman has ever said, ever. I think she is a liar. I think she's manipulative. I think she's as psychotic and crazy and murderous as Tex Watson and Charlie Manson. Anyways, they were rolling around struggling for this knife, and Susan was stabbing blindly, and she happened to stab Wojtek Frykowski in his legs several times. But okay, Susan, you were just a little innocent girl who couldn't find it in herself to bring the knife down on him. She realized she was being overpowered, so she again called Tex for help. As she did this, Wojtek began running out of the house, and Tex fired 2 shots at him. As he was running out of the house, he was quickly overtaken by Tex Watson, who began to beat him on the head and the face with the butt of his revolver. Once Tex caught up to Frykowski, it was pretty much over, and as soon as he got him, he began to beat him with the butt of the gun and stab him repeatedly until he didn't move anymore. According to Linda Kasabian's side of the story, she had been walking towards the house at this point because she'd heard all the screaming and the commotion, and she wanted to tell them to stop all this craziness. Just stop, she didn't want to be a part of this, even though she had been up until this point. She was only a few feet away when Tex overtook Wojtek Frykowski and began stabbing him. And she claims that she began yelling at everybody to stop and telling them people were coming, even though there weren't people coming. She just wanted them to stop. And as Susan Atkins walked out of the house after Wojtek and Tex, she looked at Linda and said, "It's too late now." Also, according to Linda Kasabian, at some point while Wojtek was dying, she made eye contact with him and whispered, "Oh God, I'm so sorry." I don't really think that helps him at this point, Linda. I don't think your sorries are going to really bring him back to life, but thanks for trying. While all this commotion was happening, Abigail Folger had also escaped and was running out onto the lawn. Linda Kasabian said that basically right after Susan told her it's too late, she saw Pat Krenwinkel stabbing Abigail Folger multiple times. And Pat says that she did stab her, but then she wanted to make sure she was really dead, so she called Tex over to check it out. When Tex reached Abigail and Pat, he told Pat to go to the guest house and check to make sure that there was nobody in there. And then according to his testimony, Abigail looked up and said, "I give up. I'm already dead. You've got me." But that wasn't good enough for Tex, so he proceeded to stab her until she was truly dead. Linda, seeing all of this, ran back to the gate, climbed over the gate, and got back in the car. She got back in the car. She didn't run away. She didn't run to the neighbors to call the police and get help. She ran back to the car and waited for her friends she had just seen brutally murder multiple people. Sharon Tate was the last one left alive, being guarded by Susan Atkins. Sharon Tate pled with Susan to at least spare her child's life. She told Susan, "You guys can take me, you can take me with you, and as soon as my child's born, you can kill me."
And about that time, all I can remember seeing is people just scattering in different places and running in different places. And I was left sitting with Sharon Tate, and she was talking to me, and I remember that I had absolutely, I felt nothing. I felt absolutely nothing for her as she begged for her life and for the life of her baby.
But Susan looked at her and said, "Woman, I have no mercy for you." They sat there for a while not speaking, and Susan marveled at how quiet it was in the house. According to Susan, at that point, Tex Watson came into the house with Pat Krenwinkel and said, "Kill her," referring to Sharon Tate, and that Krenwinkel echoed his statement and said, "Kill her." Susan told Tex, "I can't kill her. I have her arms, Tex. You do it." So Tex Watson ended Sharon Tate's life while Susan Atkins held her arms behind her back and allowed that to happen. After they were all dead, Susan looked everywhere for her knife, but she couldn't find it. Tex interrupted her and told her to write something on the door before they left. Susan claims that she looked down at Sharon Tate's body and thought to herself, "Wow, there's a baby in there. There's a living being inside of this dead woman that we just killed." And she claims that she considered cutting the baby out to save its life, but then she realized she couldn't do that, so instead she just dipped her finger into Sharon Tate's blood and wrote the word "pig" on the front door of the house. The only reason that William Garretson survived that night was because Pat Krenwinkel, who had been sent to check the guest cottage, claims that she walked to the back of the house and pretended to check the guest cottage, but she didn't actually check the guest cottage because she didn't want to kill anybody else tonight. She was tired. Her hand hurt because she'd been stabbing Abigail so hard and so many times that she'd actually hit bone, and so her hand hurt and she was tired. They were all covered in blood except for Linda, obviously, who was hiding in the car. And as they left, Tex Watson pushed the button on the electronic gate to make it open, leaving a very nice bloody fingerprint. When they got in the car, they were all kind of grumpy. First of all, they were kind of all pissed that Linda had run away. Pat was complaining about her hand hurting. Legitimately, she said her hand hurt. I wasn't making that up earlier. And Tex was mad at Susan because she'd left her knife behind because she couldn't find it. They all quietly removed their bloody clothing, got dressed in the spare clothes they'd brought, and Tex rolled all the bloody clothes into a bundle. And he got into the driver's seat and handed the clothes to Linda in the passenger seat and told her to throw them out the window as they were driving. Because that seems like a really effective way to get rid of bloody clothes and evidence of a murder. Just throw them out the window somewhere. A little further down the road, Tex threw the murder weapon out as they drove over the canyon. Now this murder weapon, the gun, it had a broken handle because he had hit Wojtek Frykowski with it so many times and so hard that pieces of the handle had actually broken off, and those were left at the crime scene. They used a hose in someone's yard on Portello Drive to basically rinse off and get a drink of water. And as they were doing this, they were talking in hushed tones, but the homeowners heard them and came out and asked what they were doing there. And Tex responded that they were just walking along and they wanted a drink of water. The homeowner who saw their car parked at the end of the driveway did not believe them and came outside to basically confront them. So they all dropped the hose, they ran back to the car, the homeowner's pursuing them, and they get in the car. And Tex puts the key in the ignition just as the guy reaches the car and is like grabbing at the open window. He didn't catch them, obviously, but he did get their plate number. When they got back to Spahn Ranch, Susan got an old rag out of the kitchen to clean off the car, which had blood spattered all over the outside and inside of it because they were literally dripping in blood when they got back to that car. So they were just near the car and it was getting blood on it. Charlie approached them and asked them what they were doing home so early, but he never said anything about the murders. And when Susan bragged to him that they had just killed for him, he looked at her and said, "You killed for yourself." Charlie decided himself to go to the scene of the crime and add his own little personal touch. While he was there, he took an American flag and draped it over the sofa. And then he took a towel and covered Sharon Tate's face. And he also left a random pair of horn-rimmed glasses at the scene by the trunks in the hallway, the ones that belonged to Roman Polanski and had just been delivered. A lot of people don't realize that Manson did go to Cielo Drive that night after they all left. And he mainly wanted to make sure that they had cleaned off any fingerprints and, removed all traces of themselves from the house. But I think he wanted to be a part of it in his own way. He didn't want to do any of the dirty work. He didn't want to kill anybody, but he wanted everybody to know he'd been there. Like he had to give his stamp of approval on the crime scene. The next morning, the maid, Winifred Chapman, arrived for her normal time and her normal shift at Cielo Drive, and she went in through the back door, which was the servants' entrance. The first thing she saw was Roman's trunks in the hallway, and she thought she saw what appeared to be blood on them. And then as she got closer, she saw blood on the floor next to them, as well as 2 towels nearby, which also appeaed to have blood on them. Then she walked into the living room and took in the horrific scene. And she couldn't see everything because there was a big sofa in the middle of the room and it was hiding Sharon and Jay Sebring's bodies. But she saw blood splattered everywhere. There was huge blood splatters everywhere. And as she looked out the open door onto the patio in the yard, she saw Wojtek and Abigail Folger's body, and she freaked out. She turned around, ran out through the entrance she had come into, screaming about blood and bodies and dead people. And as she ran through the driveway to the front gate, she passed Stephen Parent's Rambler and saw him dead in the car. So this woman's obviously just having a meltdown right now. Can you imagine seeing all that stuff? It's like something in a movie. I can't ever imagine really experiencing that. She ran to the neighbor's house trying to find somebody who could call the police for her. The first house she went to, nobody was home. But the second house she went to, she was in luck because there was a young man outside warming up the car. Jim Asen was only 15 at the time, but he was part of the law enforcement unit of the Boy Scouts of America, and his father was driving him to the West LA division of the LAPD that morning to work the desk. He and his parents tried to calm Winifred down, and Jim called the police, noting the exact time to be 8:33 a.m. because of his training with the Boy Scouts. While they waited, Jim and his father walked over to investigate, but they did not go inside the gate. However, they did notice that several wires had been cut, so Jim went back home and called the police a second and third time. Several units arrived within minutes of these phone calls, but they were all one-man units. So the first person on the scene was Jerry DeRosa. He interviewed Winifred Chapman, but he couldn't really get a lucid story out of her. Ray Asen, Jim's father, told the officer that the house belonged to Rudy Altobelli, but he was out of town and he had a temporary groundskeeper watching things while he was gone. He also told the officer that the current tenants were movie director Roman Polanski and his actress wife Sharon Tate. Jerry DeRosa retrieved a rifle from his squad car and he had Winifred Chapman show him how to open the electronic gate. He then proceeded very carefully, gun drawn, up the driveway. He didn't know if the perpetrator or perpetrators was still in the house or on the grounds, so he had to be very careful. When he got to Stephen Parent's Rambler in the driveway and saw the boy's body inside, he decided it would probably be a good idea to wait for backup, which arrived moments later in the form of Officer William Weisenhunt. Both officers crept back up the driveway, DeRosa with his rifle and William Weisenhunt had gotten a shotgun from his car. They searched the other vehicles and found them empty, searched the garage and the room over the garage and found that empty. And as they were doing this, they were joined by a third officer, Robert Burbridge. As they all got closer to the house, they spotted the bodies on the lawn. And the first body that they came across was Wojtek Frykowski. Frykowski was about 18 feet away from the front door. He was wearing short boots, multicolored bell-bottoms, a purple shirt, and a vest. He was lying on his side, his left hand clutching the grass. His face was so beaten and bloody that his features couldn't even be made out. Abigail Folger's body was about 20 feet further onto the lawn than her boyfriend's. She was barefoot, laying on her back in the grass. Her once full-length white nightgown was now completely red. They went inside the main house through the window in the newly painted nursery. Now, they did see Tex's entry point in the entry hall, but they decided not to use it because they figured that the murderers had used it. So that was actually a good piece of police work, probably the last good piece of police work for a while on the LAPD's part in this case. Before going into the living room, they noticed the two big blue steamer trunks in the hallway and the pair of horn-rimmed glasses sitting next to them. One of the officers also spotted two small pieces of wood on the floor next to the trunks, which looked like they'd come from the handle of a gun. When they walked into the living room, they noticed something which stood out drastically against the light and airy furnishings in the room: a big American flag draped over the back of the sofa. Once further into the room, they were able to see the bodies of Jay and Sharon. And these three men were seasoned LAPD police officers. They were not homicide detectives, but they'd still seen their share of gruesome and gore in their lives, and they all agreed that this was the worst. They checked the rest of the house and they didn't really find anything of note, but they did notice a white bassinet sitting on top of the armoire in Sharon Tate's room, a sign of a mother anticipating the arrival of her new child. Their next step was the guest house, and as they approached, they heard dogs barking and a man's voice telling them to be quiet. The cops figured they might have their suspect, so they split up around the guest cottage to basically, surround him. DeRosa went up on the screened-in front porch, and he saw a young man sitting shirtless in the living room on the couch. DeRosa kicked in the door and was promptly attacked by Rudy Altobelli's Weimaraner, Christopher, forcing him to slam the dog's face in the door until Garretson in the guest cottage called the dog off, and DeRosa was able to open the door. Now, William Garretson claims the police were very rough with him. They didn't really ask him any questions. They didn't really say anything. They just knocked him down, handcuffed him, knocked him down again, and then brought him outside. Garretson was dazed and confused as he was brought outside, and he kept asking, "What's going on?" To which one of the officers replied, "We'll show you." They proceeded to walk him through the bloody scene on the front lawn. Now, Garrettson's always been a peculiar character to me. I can't pin him down. I don't know if he knew more than he said, but I get the general impression that there's a lot to him and about his story and about his part in this night that we don't know, and we probably never will. When they showed him the bodies of Abigail and Wojtek, Garretson said that he thought Abigail was the maid, Winifred Chapman. Now, Winifred Chapman was an African-American woman, and Abigail Folger obviously was not. When he saw the body of Frykowski, he said that he thought it was the young Mr. Polanski, which the police were, suspicious about because Roman Polanski was in London. Later, when approached with these kinds of questions, Garretson would claim that he thought Frykowski was the young Mr. Polanski, referring to Roman's younger brother, that he hadn't meant Roman Polanski. Which, okay, I guess I can understand the Abigail mix-up and the Frykowski mix-up, but when he was shown Stephen Parent's body in the Rambler, he claimed he had no idea who that was. Now, this was the very same young man who had just been at his cottage the night before, who he had walked to this very same car to say goodbye, and he claimed he had no idea who he was. So that's always something that has made me question things. And I've looked into it, and there's obviously theories, Reddit's full of theories about this, and people have theories that Parent and Garretson had a homosexual relationship and they didn't want anybody to know, so he claimed he didn't know who he was. Obviously, I don't know that to be true. It still wouldn't make sense why you would claim you had no idea who this person was. You could just say he was a friend and he visited yesterday, but that's my rambling train of thought on the whole William Garretson not recognizing really any of the victims initially. He claimed he had been in the guest house all night. He was writing letters and listening to music, and he hadn't heard a thing. If Linda Kasabian heard what was going on at the house from her post at the end of the driveway, and there was people in the neighboring houses who heard screams and gunshots and things like that, and the guest house was only about 100 feet away from the main house, how did William Garretson not hear anything? Two of these people were basically killed outside. How did you not hear anything? Later, we would find out that wasn't necessarily the truth. William Garretson, at a later date, said that he saw people running outside the cottage, and at one point somebody rattled the doorknob on the cottage like they were trying to get in. But he claims that's all he heard, that's all he knows, and that didn't come out until years later. I would have really liked to have spoken to him before he passed, just to kind of get his story of that night, because there's so many contradicting stories. And this is the case in this whole situation. You've got so many contradicting stories. Tex and Susan and Linda and Pat, they all gave a story, and then they changed their stories, and then they changed back to their stories, and their stories all differ a little bit from each other's stories. So it's so difficult to kind of recreate and understand exactly what happened that night. So like I said, I had a hard time believing that Garretson didn't hear anything that night in the guest cottage, and obviously the police had a hard time believing that as well, because they arrested him and they led him down the driveway to a waiting squad car. Now, as they were exiting the property, Jerry DeRosa pushed the button with his finger to open the gate, obviously destroying the previous fingerprint that had been sitting there in blood, which was Tex Watson's. When asked about this later, he claimed he had noticed the button with the blood on it. And when asked why he pushed it anyways, he said, well, I had to get out. Had to get out, right? No other way to get out. Had to get out. Makes complete sense. What's really interesting to think of is Tex Watson had been arrested in Van Nuys not long before, and he'd been fingerprinted. And he left a very clear fingerprint of his own in the victim's blood on that button. And had DeRosa not touched it with his stupid finger, they'd grabbed that fingerprint and matched it to Tex. This whole thing would have been cleared up within hours. Days, probably, considering forensics back then. Days. But that's not what happened, because this is the LAPD we're talking about here. LAPD, they need to get out. They don't care what evidence they destroy in the meantime. I'm just messing. I'm not saying anything slanderous about the LAPD. That's just my opinion. Don't come for me. And so begins the mess of the investigation that is par the course for LAPD. Oh, I did it again. I'm not talking badly about LAPD. That's just my opinion. It's my opinion and my opinion only that the LAPD have a history and are notorious for being inept and corrupt when it comes to investigating cases. They used the police radio to call in 5 homicides at Cielo Drive around 9:40 a.m., which of course was always being closely monitored by the media, who picked up the story immediately like a pack of hungry wolves. Within no time, the steep and winding road was crawling with reporters and news fans desperate for an early scoop on this story. Inside the house, the forensics team was collecting evidence, and they found some fingerprints, bloody footprints, 3 pieces of a broken gun grip, and a buck knife, Susan's knife, under a sofa cushion. There was also a lot of drugs found in the house, 7 grams of marijuana in the living room, 30 grams of hashish in the guest bedroom nightstand, 10 capsules of MDMA and some marijuana, and a gram of cocaine in Jay Sebring's car. The amount of drugs found on the scene, I don't think was uncommon for the times. And these were people who had money, so everybody was doing some kind of drugs. And these were people with a lot of disposable income. But the police immediately thought that because of the amount of drugs that were found, this was drug related. The crime scene was a little different now when the forensics team went through than when the initial officers had gone through. The strange horn-rimmed glasses they'd found at the scene, they were now 6 feet away from that and sitting on top of a desk. The 2 pieces of wood that were part of the gun grip had been kicked underneath some tables. Nobody wanted to take accountability for that one, by the way. The multiple officers who had exited and entered that house throughout the morning had dragged in their own sets of bloody footprints and fingerprints, which added a ton of unnecessary time and work to the investigation, as once all those fingerprints and shoe prints were collected and sent away, they had to now eliminate the ones of anybody who was in that house within, that morning or the day before, because there were so many extraneous ones. That afternoon, Roman Polanski's agent, William Tennant, had the gruesome job of coming in to identify the victims. However, he was unable to identify Stephen Parent's body. Now, instead of running the license plate number to see who the car was registered to, the cops were just like, well, we'll handle this later. Whoever this kid is, we'll just let his family suffer and wonder why he never came home last night. Even though it would take minutes to run these license plates and find out who the car's registered to and who he might be, priorities. It was actually a reporter who had gotten the license plate and ran it and found out who the car was registered to, who helped break the whole mystery of who Stephen Parent was. When William Tennant saw the bodies, he had to go outside and throw up, where he was faced with multiple reporters who were literally pressed into the gate. They asked him, what's going on in there? Is somebody dead? Did anybody survive? Who is it? He didn't answer these questions, but from the condition of him and the look on his face, the reporters pretty much got everything they needed. The first homicide detectives were assigned to the case and arrived that afternoon. Sergeant Michael McGann recalls it was the worst thing he has ever seen. As he approached the house, he noticed the word pig written on the door. Officer Danny Galindo, who's also assigned to the case, remembers that they had set up a perimeter to keep the press out, but there was so many news trucks and press people. They were basically lining the drive all the way down to the main road. Police officers who actually needed to get to the scene had a hard time cutting through the throngs of reporters. After everyone left that night, Danny Galindo was left behind to guard the crime scene. Oh, can you imagine? He said that he kept wanting to sit down, but there was literally no place he could sit that wasn't touched by blood. The Manson family got their news coverage, and they watched happily as the media, every media outlet, recounted all the gruesome details of the murder of Sharon Tate and her friends. Susan, in particular, was very pleased with herself for having been chosen for a mission that was so important. And she and Tex wanted everyone to know that they had been part of that they'd been there, that it was their job and their handiwork that everyone was looking at. They were so busy patting themselves on the back that they failed to notice that the actual point of the mission, to implicate the Black Panthers, to make it look like Bobby Beausoleil was the wrong guy for the crime, that had been completely overlooked by the press. Not one report stated anything about writing on the wall or any similarities to the Gary Hinman murder. When Charlie woke up, though, this was not lost on him, and he was agitated. The whole thing had been too messy. They'd picked somebody too high profile. The entire story was about Sharon Tate and her celebrity status. They needed to do this again, and this time he was going to go along to make sure it was done right. William Garretson was being questioned. The police actually thought that they had their guy, but none of his answers were making sense. He said they were playing games with him, good cop, bad cop, and his arrest record does indicate that he appeared to be under some sort of sedation or mental strain. He agreed to take a polygraph, which it's often reported that he passed, but William Garretson did not pass his polygraph test. The results were inconclusive, and they chalked it up to the fact that he had been under the influence of some sort of a drug. In the late night hours of August 9th, 1969, Charlie called together the 4 members who had been a part of the murders the night before and 2 additional members. The 2 additional members were Clem and Leslie Van Houten. Now, Clem's real name was Stephen Dennis Groger. I'm not sure why they called him Clem, but a lot of people also called him Scramblehead because they thought that he had some mental issues or that he wasn't that smart. There is a big group of people out there, though, who believe he was just playing dumb, and I'm not sure which side I fall on. They all smoked some weed and dropped some acid, and Susan and Tex dipped back into their secret stash of speed because they knew they were going to need an edge again. This time, when they all piled into the car, every single one of them knew what they were going to do. They said the night before the girls had no idea where they were going. Tex was the only one who knew what their mission was, but this time, Charlie had been very clear about what the mission was. He said they hadn't succeeded with the previous night's murders, so they had to do it again, and they had to do it right, and that's why he was coming to make sure that it was done correctly. Linda drove, and Charlie sat in the passenger seat shouting out navigational orders. Turn here, turn here, turn here. He really didn't know where he was going. But he remembered he used to hang out at a house in a neighborhood that he thought was pretty upscale and nice enough to take notice, but not nice enough to be containing some celebrity that would overshadow the murders. So he eventually had her park in front of Rosemary and Lino LaBianca's house. Rosemary and Lino had been married for 10 years, and this was the second marriage for both of them. They both had children from their past relationships, but everyone got along well, and they had a good marriage. The house that they now occupied on Waverly Drive had been Lino's childhood home, and they had only been there for about a year. Rosemary was actually not too happy about living in the home because she believed someone was coming into their house while they weren't there. And in May of 1969, she had written to Lino's daughter, Corey, "We haven't had any more robberies, but every time I come home, I expect to either find someone in the house or something missing." That Saturday, August 9th, Rosemary and Lino had driven up to Lake Isabel to pick up Rosemary's son, Frank, who had spent the week there with his friend. They had been using Lino's boat, but when they got there, Frank said he was having so much fun he wanted to stay a little longer. So the LaBiancas agreed and headed back to LA, stopping at a newsstand on the way home at about 1 a.m. to grab a paper. While they drove home, Rosemary flipped through the paper and saw the news about the Tate murders. It made her feel very unsettled. When they got back to their house, she went to bed, but Lino stayed in the living room on the sofa reading the paper. He fell asleep like this, with the open paper on top of him, when he was awoken by someone nudging him with a gun. When he opened his eyes, he saw Charlie Manson and Tex Watson standing over him. And Charlie spoke to him in his sing-song voice and said, "Don't worry, we're not here to hurt anybody. We just want to rob you." Tex tied him up with some leather straps that he had. And as he was doing that, Manson asked Leno if there was anybody else in the house, to which Leno replied that yes, his wife Rosemary was there. She was asleep in their bedroom. Charlie retrieved Rosemary from the bedroom and brought her to the living room, where Tex covered the couple's heads with pillowcases and then tied cords from lamps around their necks to keep the pillowcases on. After this was done, Charlie left, went back to the car, where he told Leslie and Pat Krenwinkel to go into the house and help Tex with whatever he needed. And he left with Linda, Susan, and Clem. Once inside, Tex told the girls to take Rosemary back into the bedroom. Allegedly, Manson had told Tex to make sure that everybody did something. Everybody got their hands dirty. Pat went through the kitchen looking for knives, and according to her, she didn't want to kill anyone else, but she was afraid of Manson and Tex, and she thought that if she didn't go along with what they wanted, she would be made an example out of, and she too would be on the receiving end of their fury and their violence. Once Tex and Leno were alone, Tex stabbed the man through the throat with his bayonet. Rosemary, from her place in the bedroom, could hear her husband yelling and struggling, so she panicked and she asked, "What's going on? What are you doing to my husband?" And as she panicked and tried to escape, she pulled down the lamp that was attached to the cord around her neck and made a big crashing sound. Tex heard the struggle and the lamp crashing to the ground in the bedroom, so he ran in to help, stabbing the woman with his bayonet before returning to finish off her husband in the living room. According to Tex, when he returned to the bedroom, after carving the word "war" into Leno LaBianca's chest, he saw Patricia Krenwinkel stabbing Rosemary LaBianca. Remembering his orders to make sure everybody did something, he ordered Leslie to stab the woman as well, which she did, a total of 16 times. Later at her trial, Leslie Van Houten would claim that Rosemary had already been dead when she stabbed her, and some of Rosemary's wounds were made post-mortem, but not all of them. And how the hell would Leslie have known whether Rosemary was dead or alive when she proceeded to stab her 16 times? She's not a doctor. She didn't stop to take her pulse or check her vital signs. There's no way she could have known that, and I don't think that she cared. Tex then went to take a shower and clean himself off, and while he was doing that, Pat walked around the house and staged the scene. She wrote the word helter-skelter on the refrigerator. I'm sorry, she wrote the word helter-skelter because she spelled helter wrong. She spelled it Healter. Like, come on, lady. Charlie Manson's been banging this concept of helter-skelter into your head for how long? Months? It's written all over Spahn Ranch. How did you manage to misspell helter-skelter? She also wrote the words "rise" and "death to pigs" on the wall in Leno LaBianca's blood. After that, she took a 2-pronged, ivory-handled carving fork from the LaBianca's kitchen and stabbed Leno's body with it 14 times before leaving it stuck in his chest. She also thought a great finishing touch would be to take a steak knife and stick it in the man's throat, leaving it there. After they finished all of that, they enjoyed a snack of watermelon and chocolate milk in the LaBianca's home. Meanwhile, Manson was with Susan, Clem, and Linda, and he had Linda move from the driver's seat to the passenger seat so that he could drive. While she was sitting there, he handed her a wallet where she saw the smiling picture of Rosemary LaBianca looking up at her from the driver's license inside of it. Now, he told her they were going to drive through a black neighborhood, and then she would throw the wallet out, and then some black person would find it and use the credit cards and be implicated in the murder of the LaBiancas. But that didn't happen. I have a sneaking suspicion, as much as Charlie thought he knew about the city and about blacks and whites, he didn't really know where he could find a black neighborhood. So instead, he drove to a gas station and told her to go in the bathroom and throw it into the garbage there, and then hopefully somebody would just find it. While she was doing that, he walked next door to the Denny's and brought back milkshakes for all of them. He then drove them to the beach, and they walked along the sand, drinking their milkshakes. Manson held Linda's hand and talked to her about life. She told him she was pregnant, which he was happy about. Afterwards, they returned to the car, and Charlie had Linda drive to Venice, asking her about an actor that she and Sandra Good had met there not long ago. Saladin Nadir was a Lebanese actor who had picked up the girls while hitchhiking and took them back to his apartment in Venice Beach. Manson wanted Linda to bring them to Nadir's apartment so that they could kill the man. Linda drove to an apartment building and indicated that this was the actor's apartment building, and Charlie told them, okay, you guys go in, and Linda, I want you to slit his throat. And according to Linda, she looked at Charlie and said, Charlie, I can't do that. I'm not you. And he basically told her, well, you have to. The plan would be that they'd ring the doorbell or knock on the door, that Saladin and Nadir would open it, Clem would shoot him, and then Linda would take over. He told them that he was going back to the ranch and they could hitch a ride back afterwards. These people have the absolute worst plans I have ever heard of. So I'm gonna leave in our getaway car. You guys go in and kill this guy. You're probably gonna have blood on you, but then I want you to get into a car with strangers afterwards and lead these strangers back to where we all live while you're covered in blood, so that later when the news comes out about this person's murder, these people who drove you back could be like, hey, we brought 2 girls and a guy back to this Spahn ranch place and they were covered in blood and we picked them up in Venice. So they have the worst plans. They have the worst plans. Linda Kasabian claims that she purposely led the group to the wrong door, and when the person answered, she said, oh, this isn't the right person, sorry we bothered you, and then she told them, I guess I don't know where he lives, we should just, go home because we didn't have any orders of what to do in this scenario. I guess her heart was in the right place if this is true, yet I want to ask you, Linda Kasabian, what happens if, scramble-headed Clem just shot as soon as the door opened, and so some innocent person that you just led these murderers to their door end up getting killed, even though you meant to save somebody, you got somebody else killed. Did that cross your mind, Linda? Can you imagine being the person that answered the door that night though, and then later hearing what happened, like during the testimony, and knowing that you came that close to being another victim of the Manson family? The moral of the story is do not open your door to 3 hippies, or any amount of hippies, honestly. Don't do it. They got a ride back to Spahn Ranch, but nobody looked for Charlie. The other group who had been at the LaBianca's house, they had already arrived back. Nobody wanted to talk to anybody. Nobody wanted to discuss what they'd done that night. They were tired. They just wanted to go to bed. The next morning was Sunday, the day of the autopsies from the Tate murders. Now, there are crime scene photos out there. They exist on the internet. I'm not going to put them in here, even though I know because of we're talking about murders, this video is already going to be demonetized. I know that, but I'm not going to put in pictures of these people after they died. You can find them online if you want to look, but I don't think it's necessary. Sharon Tate had 16 stab wounds. Jay had been shot once and stabbed 7 times. Abigail Folger had been stabbed 28 times, and Wojtek Frykowski had been shot twice and stabbed 51 times, and he had blunt force trauma to his head from being struck with the barrel of the gun 13 times. Stephen Parent had 1 defensive slash on his wrist and had been shot 4 times. All bullet wounds were from the same .22 caliber gun. Now, Sergeant Mike McGann had been at the autopsies all morning. They started at 9 a.m., so he was away from his desk for the whole morning and most of the afternoon. He was also working with a temporary partner at this time named Jess Buckles. McGann's regular partner was out of town, so Buckles had been assigned to him until his regular partner got back. Buckles was at the office when McGann was at the autopsies, and he received a call from the LA County Sheriff's Office. They were calling because they thought that there were a lot of similarities between the Tate murders and a murder that they were looking into, the Hinman murder. And they said they had a suspect in custody on this charge named Bobby Beausoleil. Jess Buckles apparently didn't see the connection. He was like, nah, yeah, I know there's words written on the wall in blood at both these places, but it's not the same people. So he wrote it off, and he never even told McGann about it. When McGann asked him later what the sheriff's department had called about, Buckles said it was nothing. Jess Buckles is the epitome of the LAPD at this time. Yeah, the murders were really gruesome, really horrible. Things written on the wall in blood about pigs. But I don't see what you guys are seeing here. I'm positive it's drug related, and since I have this one idea in my head, there's no other possible options. I'm gonna just pursue this one idea I have in my head that really has no evidence to back it up and no real, suspects involved with it. But this is what I'm gonna go with. Thanks for your help, but we're all set here. Have a donut for me. McGann later found out about this and admits that it was a major screw-up. He says that if he'd had this information, the case would have been resolved within months. Jess Buckles single-handedly destroyed the LAPD's investigation and Manson's master plan, all in one foul swoop. Back at Spahn Ranch, the occupants were living in 2 different worlds at this point. You had the crews that were involved with the murders and had their eyes glued to every news broadcast about it. They seemed very anxious and they were always whispering to each other. And everyone else who was still living in a world of peace and love and who were a little confused as to why the others seemed so stressed out all the time. Tex Watson's mother, Elizabeth, hadn't heard from her son in a while, and she was trying to locate Tex. When Tex told Charlie that his mother was trying to find him, Charlie was like, dude, call your mom. We don't need moms showing up here just ruining our vibe. Call your mom. But Tex was paranoid because he thought his mother was working with the FBI. They'd gotten to her and they were trying to trap him. So he did not call his mother. But he told Charlie that he'd called his mother and that Elizabeth Watson had told him that the feds had been there looking for him, which threw Charlie Manson into a spiral of paranoia, even more so than usual. He was stressed out. He was like, okay, did we do something wrong? Did we leave fingerprints behind? We need to get out of Spahn Ranch. We can't be here. We're sitting ducks. They're onto us. He told the family that he could feel it in his bones. Helter Skelter was upon them, and they needed to get to Death Valley and find that bottomless pit. So they started preparations for their permanent move from Spahn Ranch to Barker Ranch. He sent a few people ahead to Death Valley to prepare for them. I don't know why, but pretty much he just sent them to get them out of his hair. Tex, he wanted him to go there and hide because the feds were looking for him, and Diane Lake because she had been his favorite girl for so long. But his new girlfriend, Stephanie Schramm, had replaced her as favorite. So he kind of just wanted her like out of the area and not longingly gazing at him every time he walked by with his new girlfriend. Diane Lake was still 15 years old at this time, which is crazy to think. She was 15 years old at this time. And on their way to Death Valley, they got picked up by a deputy who thought that Diane was a runaway, but she somehow managed to convince him that she was 19 years old. On Sunday night, Rosemary's son got back from Lake Isabel, and he noticed that the speedboat wasn't in the garage and that all the blinds in the house were drawn, which was strange. So he knocked on the door, and when he didn't get an answer, he called his older sister, Suzanne, who showed up with her boyfriend, Joe. The three of them went into the house, and Suzanne stayed in the kitchen while the boys searched the rest of the place. While she was in the kitchen, she noticed the misspelled Helter Skelter on the refrigerator, and she was kind of looking at it, puzzled, when the two guys came into the kitchen and said they needed to call the police. Galindo was at the police station when he got a call from a reporter who said he was about to get another call about another murder that was almost exactly like the Tate murders. The reporter also told him that in this case, there had been a knife stuck in the throat of one of the victims. As soon as Galindo hung up with the reporter, the call did come in, and he went over to Waverly Drive to check out the crime scene for himself. Now, Galindo would be the only officer, the only investigative officer who would be at both crime scenes. This was on him to see the similarities and put them together. What he noticed most, though, was that there was pillowcases over Rosemary and Leno's heads, and you could not see, on first glance, the knife stuck in the throat. Only once the pillowcases were removed for them to show him the extent of what had happened did he see the knife. So he knew that somebody in the force, somebody, a police officer, somebody on the scene had spilled this little tidbit to the press, because otherwise they wouldn't have known it by just looking in through the windows. Galindo did obviously notice similarities between the two crime scenes because they were similar. But when asked by the press if he thought that the two crimes were connected, he said, no, we think this is just a copycat crime. Besides the mode of the killing, the victims have nothing in common. Even though these murders were so similar, the two sets of detectives working on each case were never working together. Galindo had been the only person who'd been at both scenes, and he'd drawn the conclusion that he didn't think that they were related, and they all kind of followed that incorrect conclusion. From now on, when I refer to the investigators that are covering each specific case, the Tate case and the LaBianca case, I'll refer to them as the Tate squad or the LaBianca squad, just to keep things less confusing. Something did go according to the plan for Manson, though. He had LA in the throes of terror. 200 guns were sold at one Beverly Hills sporting goods store in 2 days, and the price of a guard dog went up from $200 to $1,500. Now, the authorities thought there was some sort of car theft ring operating on Spahn Ranch, so they had planned to raid the place on August 13th, but for some reason it had to be postponed. And Charlie sent Linda Kasabian to visit Bobby Beausoleil in jail and tell him to keep quiet. They were working on getting him out. She was unable to get in to see him, though, because she hadn't brought her ID with her. At this point, Linda claims she wanted out, and then she realized she was out. She wasn't at Spahn Ranch. She had the opportunity to run, which she did, leaving her daughter Tanya behind at the Manson family ranch. She fled to New Mexico, where she found her estranged husband, Robert Kasabian, living there with another woman. And she told him she had to leave Tanya behind because she was scared. She knew if she went back, they wouldn't have let her leave. Robert wanted to leave immediately and go get their daughter from the ranch, but Linda was terrified. Sandra Good and Mary Bruner were still in jail on stolen credit card charges, but Sandy was very pregnant and she was released. However, Mary was held on new charges, which were credit card fraud, because she'd been the one who had signed the slip. Now, many of the straight Satans would come and go from Spahn Ranch because of their relationship with the family, but one came and stayed, and his name was Danny DiCarlo. He had told his brethren in the straight Satans that he couldn't leave. He felt like Manson wouldn't let him leave. And the straight Satans were already upset with the family because of the botched drug deal. So they had the plan that they were going to go to the ranch and get Danny DiCarlo back. On August 15th, a group of straight Satans arrived at Spahn Ranch to get DiCarlo back and to show Charlie Manson who was boss. But when they found Charlie on the ranch, he didn't seem afraid and he didn't seem to recognize their hostile intentions. All he did was offer them drugs and women, and for a while that distracted them. But when they remembered why they were there and they started grumbling about bringing DiCarlo to them, Charlie calmly told them that he had snipers on the roofs of Spahn Ranch buildings with their guns pointed at the straight Satans. And on Charlie's word, they would shoot, so they should probably leave. They figured they would not be getting their friend back that night, so they left, but they left a member behind so that this person could grab Danny in the morning and they could leave. That was not to be, however, because in the early hours of the morning of August 16th, the Spahn Ranch occupants were awoken by helicopters and police officers outside telling everybody to come out. The raid that had been planned for August 13th and postponed was finally happening. And like I said, they were not there to arrest them for multiple murders. They were there to arrest them for stealing cars and turning them into dune buggies. So can you imagine the sigh of relief that everybody who was involved in the murders must have let out when they realized they were just being arrested for car theft and not for murder? They took most of the dune buggies and they arrested everybody there, including Charles Manson, but they could not hold them because the warrant that they had brought with them still had the date of August 13th on it. They had not changed it. So because of the small paperwork inconsistency, they had to let everybody go a day later, but they did keep the stolen cars and dune buggies. After being bugged by Robert Kasabian for long enough, Linda did call the ranch to inquire about her daughter Tanya. And when she called, she got Pat Krenwinkel on the phone, who was giving her a hard time about running away. Finally, Squeaky Fromm got on the phone and said, listen, your daughter got taken into foster care after the raid here, and just leave us alone. Don't call again. Together with a social worker, Linda returned to LA and somehow managed to regain custody of her daughter. She returned to New Mexico but did not stay there long. She then hitchhiked to Florida, to her father's place, didn't stay there long either, and she ended up back with her mother in New Hampshire. Between the raid and the straight Satans, Charlie was at peak paranoia level. He figured that somebody had to have had snitched in order for the cops to know where they were and what they were doing. And in his crazed and heated mind, he put the blame on ranch hand Donald Shorty Shea. Squeaky, who had spent a lot of time spying on George Spahn at Charlie's request, had often heard Shorty going to the old man and telling him to get the long hairs off the ranch. It was lowering the property value, and once he got them off, he should just sell the ranch to property developers. He had even offered multiple times to get them off the ranch himself. So Manson figured that Shorty had gone to the police in an effort to remove them from the ranch. And now their dune buggies were gone, which had jeopardized the group's chances of getting out to Death Valley before the apocalypse happened. Shorty had caused problems for Charlie and his family, and now he had to pay. On August 25th or 26th, Shorty got into a car with Charlie, Clem, and Bruce Davis. It's not known whether he got into the car willingly or if he was forced in, but either way, they drove away with him and nobody saw him again. Around the ranch, about 10 p.m. that evening, it was reported that his screams could be heard echoing through the hills. The group had allegedly brought Shorty down a hill behind the movie ranch and stabbed him to death. Bruce Davis and Gypsy took Shorty's possessions, put them in his car, and drove away, abandoning it somewhere. And when the other ranch hands asked Charlie if he knew where Shorty was, Charlie said that he was probably in San Francisco because he told Shorty that there was a job there. By the first week in September, Charlie realized they couldn't put it off any longer. Dune buggies or no dune buggies, they had to get everybody out to Death Valley, and quick. They stole a bunch of other vehicles, and Charlie and about 24 of his followers piled in, drove out to Death Valley, and spread out between Barker and Meyer Ranch. He had them dig holes in the ground to store food and weapons. He had them dig barracks into the sides of mountains. But most importantly, every single day he sent teams out to the desert to find the bottomless pit in the Enchanted City. In order to do that, they would basically have to go out to the desert and then just start digging holes. So that's pretty much what they did all day. They went out into Death Valley and dug holes in the sand. At night, there was LSD, campfires, and more bedtime stories from Charlie. He would talk about the people he killed in great detail and why he had to kill them, including Lots of Papa and Shorty Shea. He said that these people had put the family at risk, that they'd betrayed the family in some way, so they had to be dealt with. The message was very clear. You're either with us or you're against us. And if you're against us, you're going to end up like one of these guys. Manson didn't want the girls and Tex to talk about what had happened at Sharon Tate's house, but Susan could not help herself. Susan loved to talk about the murders. It was her favorite topic. And one day she was talking to 17-year-old Ruth Ann Morehouse about exactly how it had gone down. And Morehouse was excited. She couldn't wait till she would be chosen to go on one of these missions herself. Another member, Barbara Hoyt, heard the two girls talking and realized that things were getting a little crazy here and it was time to get out. So she and another girl, Sherry Cooper, they decided to take their chances with the desert. Charlie had figured that Death Valley was too far out, remote, and inhospitable for anybody to escape, and it would encourage people to stay put. But they slipped past the guards, they walked for 16 hours in the desert, and they finally reached a general store where they were able to hitch a ride back to LA. Barbara called her mother and told her she was coming home. Once home, Barbara told her mother about everything, the murders and everything, but her mother did not believe her. Barbara was so terrified that the Manson family was going to come for her, she couldn't even sleep at night. She just stayed up with a big butcher knife, sitting in bed and waiting for the other shoe to drop. On September 1st, a 10-year-old boy named Stephen Weiss had found a gun sitting in his backyard. His father, Bernard Weiss, had called the Van Nuys substation to report it. An officer came that same day to pick up the weapon. When questioned by Vincent Bugliosi in court, the 10-year-old claimed he had picked up the gun by the tip of the barrel to avoid leaving fingerprints on the handle. He also testified that when the officer came to his home to collect the gun, the officer had touched it with both hands all over the gun. Another funny but terrifying piece of testimony from Stephen Weiss came when he said the officer had asked Stephen's father to open the barrel and remove the bullets, since he himself did not know how. So the murder weapon is discovered on September 1st, and then the cop who came to get it, he proceeded to put his hands all over it. But do you think this would help the investigation? It should have, right? It should have. The murder weapon is discovered. No, because the gun found in Stephen Weiss's backyard and the murders that had happened in LA a couple weekends prior, the connection was not made between those. The police were literally scouring the United States and Canada looking for this gun. The gun that they knew what kind it was, what caliber it was, and knew it had a broken handle. And it sat in an evidence room in an envelope at the Van Nuys substation. Such a facepalm moment. The family had been at Barker Ranch for only a couple of weeks before everybody started to get restless. Not only was their food running out, but their drugs were running out quicker. They literally had only a sack of brown rice, a container of powdered milk, and a container of cinnamon. It's like a bad Top Chef challenge. What can you make with a bag of brown rice, some powdered milk, and cinnamon? Make a feast. Charlie took the family's school bus and went back to LA to see if he could scrounge up some money for food, and he began asking his old acquaintances, including Greg Jacobson. When Greg Jacobson saw Charlie in his true form, crazy-eyed, crazy-haired, looking pretty much like desperate, Greg said, "I don't have any money for you, but you need to get back to the desert immediately. You don't belong in the city anymore, Charlie." He somehow managed to get some money and get some food, and he sped back to the desert where he knew their rations were running out to become the celebrated hero who arrived with more food. They ate that night, but there was that little part in the back of his head that said he knew this was going to become a vicious cycle. They were going to run out of food again. He was going to have to do this all over again, and he was getting tired of it. And everybody else was getting tired of it too. When was Helter Skelter coming? This is why we had to come out here. When was it happening? Why haven't we found that damn pit yet? We've dug a million holes in the desert. And no matter how far they went, they could never escape the law. There was park rangers prowling Death Valley and the surrounding areas always. On one of their missions to find the bottomless pit, they came across a big earth-moving machine in the middle of a road that they often used to go back and forth. And so they stripped the machine for any parts that they could use, and then they set it on fire. Once the Rangers investigated it, they found nearby tire tracks that belonged to a Toyota four-wheel drive vehicle of some kind. And when they started questioning locals, they were told that a group of hippies who drove that kind of vehicle were hiding someplace in the desert. A couple of days later, one of these rangers spotted Tex and a couple other girls driving in a red Toyota four-drive vehicle. So they basically went over there to talk to them, and Tex ran away, as he does, and the other girls that were left behind really didn't have much to say to them. They questioned them and wrote down the information of the Toyota, but they had to eventually let them go because they didn't know for sure if this was the car or if these were the people. Once they got back to the station and they ran the information, they realized that the registration information didn't match the type of car it was. So they really wanted to look into these hippies some more. They decided to send a couple guys out into the desert, a highway patrolman and the ranger who had initially seen Tex. And they came upon Barker Ranch. And when they got there, they didn't really see anything of interest. They only found 2 girls inside. Everybody else was out on a mission looking for the bottomless pit. Legitimately, that's where they were. So they only found these 2 girls inside, and the 2 girls didn't really make any sense when they questioned them, so they left. But as they were leaving the area, they came across Paul Crockett and Brooks Poston. They asked Crockett and Poston if they knew anything about a group of hippies living in the desert, and Poston and Crockett spilled the tea. They told them all about Charlie, how he was crazy, how he had weapons, how he was controlling all these young kids, and that he had always talked about killing people, and rumor was in the desert that he had actually gone through with it. The officers went back to Barker Ranch to take a closer look, and as they went further onto the property, they spotted some more people, about 7 girls, all of them naked. When the ranger and highway patrolman asked the girls who they were, Lynette Frome flirtatiously walked over and said, "We're a troop of Girl Scouts from the San Francisco Bay Area. Would you like to be our scoutmasters?" Squeaky Fromm had some inventive role-playing games up her sleeve. Realizing they weren't going to get anything useful out of these women, they continued to search the area, and that's when they found 2 vehicles in the back hidden under some tarps, a dune buggy and the elusive red Toyota. Both of these vehicles had gun holders welded to their fronts with a rifle in each one. In a smart move, they decided to basically take some parts out of the Toyota so that it wouldn't run until they could actually get a grasp on what was happening with it. So they did that, and then they went back to the office to check the registration and plates on both vehicles. But freaking Tex Watson, who is the best at running and hiding, better than anybody I've ever known, he emerges from hiding because he's been there the whole time that these guys were on the property, and he Frankensteins the Toyota back together with parts from other vehicles, and then he takes it and he goes and hides it in the desert. Tex will try to have you believe that he spent most of his days in a drug-induced haze and he didn't know what was going on, but the guy was not stupid. Not stupid at all. Once the Rangers discovered both of these vehicles were stolen, they figured between the crazy story they'd heard from Poston and Crockett and what they discovered on the ranch, there was something nefarious going on over there. They began to put a team in place to raid Barker Ranch. Speaking of Crockett and Poston, once they'd snitched, they realized that probably they weren't going to be taken seriously right away, and they should probably get out of Dodge. So they left with their group, and they settled in nearby Independence. When Charlie found out about the lawmen that had been on the ranch, and Tex told him what they'd done to the car, Charlie realized it would only be a matter of time before they moved on to Myers Ranch next. So he took Tex to Myers, gave him a shotgun, and said, "Go up in the attic and just sit there with your shotgun and wait for them to come. And when they do, kill him." While Tex sat in this tiny, cramped little attic, sweating and bored out of his mind with no drugs to keep him company, he started contemplating his life decisions. What if Charlie Manson was crazy? What if he was wrong? What if there was no enchanted city? He didn't want to follow Charlie anymore, and he definitely didn't want to sit in this attic with a gun waiting for people to come that might not ever even come. So he got down, he grabbed one of the other vehicles they had hidden on Myers Ranch, and he left. When he got back to civilization, he called his parents in Texas and asked them to wire him some money so he could fly home. His sister picked him up at the airport, and after she got one look at him, she was like, "Oh no, before we even get home, you need to go and get a haircut." The police were getting frustrated as September drew to a close. There was no new leads, and a high-profile case like this not being solved was making them look really bad. They didn't have a plan. They didn't have a next step. So they actually tipped off the media as to what kind of gun they were looking for. I guess the Van Nuys division was sleeping the day that this story was printed in every newspaper. But you know who wasn't sleeping? Bernard Weiss, Stephen Weiss's father, the little boy who had found the gun. He was confused as to why they were still looking for the gun because he'd given them the gun. This was the same type of gun, the same caliber. It had a broken handle. What the heck? But he assumed the police knew what they were doing. Bad assumption, Bernard. On September 23rd, Mary Bruner was finally released from prison. Mary, Manson's first ever follower. She was released and she went back to Spahn Ranch. And once she realized everybody was gone, she went home to her mother, who had gotten custody of Pooh Bear through LA County. Crockett and Poston met with Inyo County Sheriff's Deputy Don Ward on October 3rd. They wanted a chance to give a more thorough and detailed description of Charlie and his followers and what they were doing. Tex Watson, back home in small town Texas, was not doing well. He pretty much locked himself in his room and would scream when anybody got near his door, yelling at his parents to just go away. When he finally did come out, he asked his parents for money again, and then he took off to Mexico, where he did some more contemplating. Maybe Charlie wasn't crazy. Maybe the world was going to end. Maybe if he didn't get back there, he was going to miss his chance at the Enchanted City, where he would be safe from all of this. So he went back to California. Tex leaving was a big blow to Charlie, and he wanted to make sure that it didn't happen again. But he really only had Clem left as an enforcer. Although Clem wandered around with a rifle and said he was Charlie's enforcer, he wasn't the sharpest crayon in the box, and nobody really respected him or took him seriously. The family had basically been split into factions at this point. All the veteran members like Sandra Good, Squeaky Fromm, Bruce Davis, and Susan Atkins, nobody really trusted them. They knew that these people had been with Charlie since the beginning, and they would turn on them and snitch on them if they had the chance. And Susan just would not shut up about these murders she'd committed, which scared a lot of people, including Kitty Lutzinger, who was Bobby's girlfriend. She was pregnant with his child. She had never really wanted to be with the family anyways. She had just followed Bobby there, and when he'd gotten arrested, she ended up staying. And Susan had just recently told her that Bobby was about to go on trial for murdering somebody. Everybody else had told her that Bobby was just in jail on some small charges and he'd be out any day. But Susan, who loved running her mouth and delivering juicy information, told Lutzinger the truth. Kitty was sick of being in the desert. Being pregnant was hard enough, but being pregnant in Death Valley was absolute torture. The whole vibe in the group had turned very dark and violent, and Charlie was frustrated and angry all the time, and he took it out on his new girlfriend, Stephanie Schramm, knocking her about whenever he was upset, which seemed to be all the time lately. The raid on Barker Ranch happened on the morning of October 10th, and as the police crept up to the place, it was so dark and they didn't really know where they were. They ended up tripping over two people who were laying on the ground sleeping with a gun between them, Clem and another member who were supposedly Charlie's guard duty. They were arrested, and after that they systematically went through the ranch and arrested everybody they could find. Next was Myers Ranch, where they took everybody into custody there. Out of the 11 vehicles on the property, 8 of them were stolen. They took everybody to Independence and booked them. Lucky for Charlie, he wasn't there because on October 9th, he'd left to go to LA to make another food run. And Stephanie Schramm and Kitty Lutzinger thought this would be the perfect time to make their escape because when Charlie wasn't around, everybody was a lot more relaxed, as you could tell from Clem sleeping on the ground while he was supposed to be on guard duty. So they snuck out, but they got really turned around. Death Valley at night is pretty much a maze, and they just wandered and wandered for hours, getting more and more panicked as morning drew closer because they knew once everybody woke up and realized that they were gone, they would come looking for them, and they would probably find them. They ended up just walking in circles around the ranch until they saw the headlights of the police officers leaving the ranch and bringing all their prisoners back to Independence. They flagged them down and begged to be taken as well, and they let them know that they were not a part of this, they had wanted to get away, and they had been trying to escape. They were put into protective custody and kept separate from the other prisoners so that they wouldn't know that they were there. When their parents were called, Kitty's mother told her that LA County detectives had been trying to get a hold of her because they wanted to question her before they put Bobby on trial. The Inyo County cops contacted the LA cops and they wanted to talk to Kitty, and Kitty agreed because at this point, she didn't have loyalties to anybody but herself. Several members had gotten away from the ranch during the raid, including Diane Lake and Bruce Davis. And someone contacted Charlie at Spahn Ranch to inform him about what had happened. He drove back to Barker Ranch and collected his remaining family, where they all put their heads together to figure out a plan of what they would do next. The plan they came up with was to do nothing, to stay on Barker Ranch, and hopefully something would occur to them and then they could take the next step, which was, once again, an incredibly stupid plan. Now that the law knew about Barker Ranch's existence and Charlie and his family's part in stealing cars, they'd be watching and they'd be back. And they wanted Charlie Manson because he was the head of the group. They wanted to see if he was going to be stupid enough to come back to the ranch after the raid and stay. And you know what? He was. They descended on Barker Ranch again on the afternoon of October 12th. When they burst into the main building, they saw 7 people sitting around a table, and they ordered them all outside and handcuffed. But none of these people were the elusive Charlie Manson. So, as they got everybody in the truck ready to bring them back to Independence, one officer decided to take one last look inside before he left. It was dark, so he had a candle. He was kind of creeping around inside. He basically didn't see anything. But as he kind of peered around, he saw a small cabinet with what appeared to be some strands of hair just hanging out of it. It was like a kitchen cabinet, guys, like the kind you put pots and pans in. And the officer said, no, that can't be possible. There can't be a grown person hiding in this cabinet. And as he brought his candle lower to check it out, he literally saw the cabinet door open and a grown man, even though he's not tall, he's a little guy, but he's a grown man, unfold himself out of this cabinet and stand up and say, hi. Charles Manson had been Harry Pottering himself inside this cabinet while the raid was going on, and now he came out to say hello. When he was asked what his name was, Charlie responded, Charles Manson, in a very friendly and non-threatening way. Charlie was wearing his fancy buckskin suit, and he seemed completely unbothered and unfazed as he was led outside, handcuffed, and put in the truck with everybody else. The trucks drove back to Independence with everybody stuffed inside the bed, and the girls were whispering and giggling amongst themselves. Charlie was annoyed by that, so he gave them one look and shut them up, and then he told the police officer who was watching them in the back, you know, the blacks are going to rise up against the whites, and you guys are going to be main targets because you're law enforcement, so you should just let us go. But that didn't convince them, and they didn't let them go. They brought them to the Independence jail, and they booked them, including Charles Manson. Between the 2 raids, they now had 27 people in custody. They were all charged with grand theft auto and arson, and Charlie gave his name as Charles Manson, aka Jesus Christ, God. Okay, so I'm gonna end this here. I'm gonna record part 6 tomorrow so I can get it out really shortly after this, but I just don't want these to be too long or they're gonna take forever to edit and upload. So this way I can break them down into more manageable videos for you guys. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Part 6 will be out very soon and that will be the last part, but I do have a bonus video for you guys which will basically wrap everything up. And it'll probably be out the same day or like the next day after part 6. Okay, guys, stay kind and stay beautiful. Thank you so much. Love you.
She's like
Bye.
a sickness in my brain, a vision standing by the window pane. She ripples through the blinds and leaves me in a daze. It's in the way her body moves.